Hi, and welcome to the I Teed Myself podcast. My name is Matthew Miniman, and this is episode 85. What can Operation Spider's Web teach us about dwell time? So, Operation Spider's Web. This was a military operation carried out June 1st, 2025. This being June 8th, 2025. This is a very recent piece of news, and I don't often approach recent news stories in this podcast, except when they deal directly with cybersecurity. But this one is really interesting. This one has me kind of tickled in a way, and we'll just get right into it. So, if you're not sure what Operation Spider's Web is, it was an operation carried out by the Ukrainian government against Russian targets. And specifically, what makes this really interesting is that this is a fairly in-depth example of how you go about a covert operation. Now, you do have to understand this is a covert operation. This wasn't strike team or anything like that. This wasn't guys with guns going out and performing an action. This was actually kind of closer to like an Ocean's 11 movie or some bullshit like that, because the way that this was carried out was actually pretty interesting. So to give you an idea, this apparently took 18 months to start from start to finish to complete. So the way this works, imagine this: you're Ukraine and you want to strike against Russia's strategic whatever. You want to strike against Russia strategically, and you want to use drones to do that because you can't sneak people into the country, or at least sneaking people into the country is more difficult, and you can only sneak a few. And if one person gets caught, it becomes a huge issue. Anyway, the whole thing is that you're kind of stuck trying to figure out how to sneak something in there to strike against Russia strategically. Now, I'm not going to speak on any of the politics of this. This is war. It's it's kind of bullshit in general. But the thing here is that the tactics of it are pretty awesome. So they planned to do this 18 months in advance, and what seems to have happened is that one Ukrainian national actually was able to get into Russia and open up a trucking business in Russia, a legitimate trucking business that hired several workers and several trucks to transport goods across Russia. Now, Russia's gigantic, so holy shit. Yeah, it covers a significant part of the world's landmass. And so moving products, moving goods, moving services across Russia is probably a pretty big business in Russia. So as this Ukrainian national opens up this trucking company, there's this opportunity to move stuff across the country that there may not have been before. And because it's legitimate, because they are moving just legitimate stuff, it can really allow the Ukrainian government to put things into the shipments. And so that's actually what happens is the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian office or bureau or whatever that's in charge of this attack decides to start shipping a lot of drones with legitimate Russian interests. And so what it sounds like happened, and again, we are significantly there's not a lot of information about this because it did just happen. So I am just kind of covering what we do know already. So what it seems like happened is that the Ukrainian government was able to sneak in about 117 or so drones into the Russian territory. And once they were all in place. And once they had enough in the right position, what they did is they basically, some of these drones were in mid transport when they decided to launch this operation. And so what happened was they launched this operation. And when you are attacking with drones in Russia, you have to be able to account for a lot of different factors. So one of the things that you have to account for is the fact that Russia, they have a very strict control over their broadcast network. Like they see signals, and if they see something they don't recognize, they act against it. Again, the USSR was extremely paranoid about espionage, and the Russian government that has been born out of the USSR is much the same way. And so, strict control over radio broadcasts, strict control over that sort of thing. And so one of the things that they did is they actually loaded these drones with SIM cards and cellular communications platforms so that they could be controlled remotely. But not only that, they had to make sure that these didn't use any sort of GPS or any sort of jammable tracking software. So they used something called dead reckoning, which is not a great way to navigate if you're going in blind. But these operators who utilize these drones were able to fly them from their initiation location to their target destinations. And they were basically using small 7-pound explosive charges. And so these aren't gigantic bombs at all. These are the drones they are using are some of the same quadcopter drones that you can buy off the internet. They're like maybe $2,000 if you really want to go on the high end, but these are not expensive drones. They're small, they're mobile. And so it's not like they're military drones. These are small consumer grade drones that are able to do this. So there are a lot of things going in Ukraine's benefit here. Not only is it that the Ukrainian government was able to sneak in use smaller drones to pull off this operation, but they were also able to ship them because they were smaller in packaging that they could mask it. Sounds like, from what we know, that they were packaged in or alongside these mobile cabins. It sounds like they are similar to mobile homes, and so they don't need. Yeah, they're basically like Soviet bloc mobile homes is what they look like. It's called a portakabin. So they were able to store them in the store a bunch in these portakabin transports, and that's where a vast majority of these were. So when the attack occurs, they go after the Russian aircraft storage locations for their strategic bombers. So these are kinds of aircraft that are utilized to launch, or that could be used to launch, nuclear weapons. They are also the ones that are primarily used to strike for long distance bomb runs with conventional bombs. But these are essentially the bombers that Russia has used to kind of terrorize and overwhelm the Ukrainian government's defense force. So it's a large and high precision attack, and through this attack, they are able to destroy more than 40 aircraft and successfully destroy them or damage them in such a way that they are destroyed. Because a lot of these bombers were created during the Soviet era, and those aren't made anymore. None of the parts are made anymore, and so repairing them is going to be a pain and probably not worth it for the Russian government to do. Now, the whole aftermath of this is that we estimate that in general, it's estimated that it's $7 billion worth of damage. You only using $2,000 drones. So if we say that it was 117 drones and that there were that they cost about $2,000. We'll go on the high end here. Ukrainian government spared no expense for this. We're saying they caused a bunch of damage, $7 billion worth of damage for just about $350,000. That's pretty significant impact, right? So it's huge. This is a tremendous attack. Now, all that being said, what can we learn about this? Well, how does this relate to cybersecurity? Well, here's the thing, that there is a metric that we identify in cybersecurity. It's actually one of our KPIs, or at least it should be. The KPI, key performance indicator, is a measure of success. And so for security teams, it's hard to measure that success, because you can say, oh, well, I defended against 9 billion attacks. But if you miss one and that one attack is successful, you suck at your job, right? Like that's kind of a shitty thing to compare. It's 9 billion to 1 seems like great odds until, the one was the one that succeeded. So you can't really use attacks that you defend against. You can't really use how many times a user didn't click on a phishing link. Like that's not great. You can't measure how many times a file was stopped or how many times malicious links were stopped, because again, those are all those can be user controlled. So the metrics, one of the metrics that we can use to identify the success of a defensive team is called dwell time. And dwell time is the basis of which an attacker has in your environment. It's the amount of time that an attacker has in your environment before they are detected or acted upon. And so in the industry today, Mandiant, which is a large security company owned by Google now, Mandiant reported in their trends report, their cybersecurity trends report, they reported that attackers had an average of 11 days of dwell time, which means an attacker had 11 days to do whatever the fuck they wanted inside of that infrastructure before they were detected, which is significant, because as an attacker, you give me 11 days, that's a shit ton of time for me to stumble around your network. Now, I'm probably not going to dedicate those 11 days to doing whatever I want in your network. I got other things to do. I might be attacking somebody else at the same time. I might need to go pizza. I'm obviously going to get drunk at least 2 of those days because I'm an attacker. I got nothing else to do. Piece of shit. Actually, I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe there are some more worthwhile, Jeff Bezos of attackers or something like that. I have no fucking clue. Anyway, the whole point is that they have 11 days to act within your environment, and this dwell time is an area where they or a time period where they can look at and find what they're going to attack and how they're going to approach your organization. Now, for those of you who are longstanding practitioners, you've more than likely heard of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And in this MITRE ATT&CK framework, we have a lot of different phases that MITRE has assigned for this for attackers to perform actions inside of your organization. And so inside of when an attacker is inside of your environment, one of the things that they're going to do is they're going to start launching different types of attacks to identify what they can get into. And so they're gonna do some execution and persistence and privilege escalation, and then they're gonna try to attempt to have some defensive events evasion, as well as do discovery within your environment. So this is where an attacker is there, constantly doing an Nmap scan on your internal network, trying to see what else they can get into. They're attempting to gain control of as many accounts and systems as they possibly can. They're trying to identify attack points, places where they can get to data, the data that is within there, so they know what data to take, what data they can hit, what data they can delete. They're looking at trying to identify what your disaster recovery plan is, how they're going to prevent it or delay it. They're doing everything they can within your environment to try to identify how they're going to attack. And then once they're ready to initiate an attack, they will just do it. And so in an attack, if you haven't detected the attacker in your environment yet, they have that 11 days. Now, Mandiant's report does break out the dwell time based on detection mechanism or detection method. And so when an attacker is the one that lets you know that they are in your system, that is oftentimes less than 10 days. So an attacker comes in again to your environment, and they average about 10 days before they act on your stuff. And this typically means that an attacker's gotten in, they've gotten what they wanted, and now they're ransoming your stuff. That's typically how an attacker will let you know, hey, I've got your data, now I'm going to ransom it. And so you now know that they've been in your network, which is too late to know. On top of that, the attacker can often do whatever they want, but they oftentimes will leave themselves back doors that they'll sell. And so, I as an attacker, I'm going to try to extort you for as much money as possible, but then I'm also going to sell my access to your environment to the highest bidder just because I can. I'm going to collect on both ends. So even if you pay the ransom, I'm still going to make money on the deal. I'm going to make more money on the deal. And if you don't pay the ransom, I'm still going to make money on the deal because, I'm a piece of shit. Anyway, whole reason being here is that an attacker will let you know within 10 days. The 11-day mean time is typically achieved by internal alerting, identifying when an attacker is in your environment. And this alerting is anything from an EDR to a SIM to a SOAR to an IPS on a firewall or whatever. So there's a lot of different identifiers here, or a lot of different mechanisms that you can use to identify an attacker. The problem is that 11 days, especially in my opinion, is way too fucking long to identify when an attacker is in your environment. There needs to be much earlier indication for your stuff. You need to know when attackers got in. And the dwell time does depend on you being able to identify the data and traffic and identify when there's something suspicious up there. So there are a lot of different detection mechanisms. And we've talked about a lot on previous episodes of this podcast: a SIM, a Suricata, enrichment platforms, AI analysis for behavioral anomalies, anomalous detection for system operations. These are all opportunities for you to detect an attacker. So when you are looking at your dwell time and you're using your internal metrics to identify that, you need to sort of understand where your notifications are going to come from. And not only that, you have to listen and react to when those specific alerts trip. You can't just get alerted and ignore it. That doesn't count. You actually have to do something about that alert. So that's why SOAR is a really good idea. If you can build your workflows and your frameworks a little bit more maturely. So beyond that, when an attacker gets in and they're alerted by an outside monitoring solution, that can take up to or around, the meantime is actually 24 days. Sounds like it can take as much as 6 months for an external resource to identify when an attacker has gotten into your system. So not great. And those solutions are a problem because a lot of those solutions tout themselves as, oh, well, we're a cybersecurity solution. We'll let you know when an attacker's in your environment. And the problem is that they're not active enough. They don't really have any skin in the game. And so when they see something, it has to be extremely overt. So external monitoring resources aren't necessarily the greatest. And you have to, if you're going to go with one of these external monitoring solutions, you've got to make sure that they are kind of tuned appropriately to respond to an event when it occurs. And one of the other things that you do have to also live with is a high level of false positives, because if you don't have false positives triggering within your environment, your alerting might be tuned to such that you're attacking yourself with blinding. You're blinding yourself from attacks, and that can be a problem. So anyway, in that 11 days, as an attacker, I'm going to craft this entire plan where I'm going to operate within your environment and attempt to gain as much of your secrets, and then I'm going to act. And so I'm going to do whatever I can to action on my objectives. And these objectives are all kind of dependent upon what the attacker is trying to do. What are you going to do as an attacker? What are you after? Are you after money? Are you after extorting funds? Are you trying to change the route of a wire? What are you attempting to do? And so all attackers have different objectives, and so they're not going to all go the same route. They're all not going to be trying to do the same thing, but most of them are really trying to damage your company or your organization. That is what an attacker is attempting to do. They're going to damage your company, your organization in one way or another. And they're going to do this with very little expense on their own part. I mean, no attacker is really ever going to spend significant amount of money to attack you. They are really going to do everything very cheaply, but it can cost your business millions and millions of dollars just by virtue of having to report an incident, the loss in reputation, the loss in manpower, and whatever else is going to happen. It can cause a significant amount of disruption in your business. So as an attacker, I can really break your company with little to no expense to myself. And so that's a lot like how the Ukrainian government was able to get these drones in there and act on Russia. They were able to be an insider. They were able to act within Russia because there was this giant dwell time, 18 months of dwell time before they were alerted, and they were only alerted by after the fact. Once the attacker had actioned on the objectives, that was it. That they knew they were in, but that was the only time they had indication that the attacker was in. Because again, dwell time isn't the time between when you detect somebody or between when an attacker gets in and you detect them. Because I'm sure Russia had sniffs of when when these drones were being brought in. Obviously, if this person from Ukraine registered a new business within 18 months, they had a fucking opportunity to stop them. But they didn't, because they weren't listening and they weren't looking for the things that were identifiers of compromise. They weren't looking at their IOCs. They weren't trying to identify when they were in. And so this giant 18-month dwell time allowed for the Ukrainian government to build up a plan of what they were going to attack, to try to identify all of the pieces that they needed and get them in place to perform the attack. Just like an attacker is going to do within your environment. They're going to take over strategic pieces of your environment. They're going to make sure they control them and that they can adjust them how they want. And then once they're in place, once they have everything exactly where they need to be, or they've determined that they have been caught and they are about to lose access, they will action on the objective. They will do as much damage as possible and attempt to act. So it is important that if you do know the information, if you do have the data with you that identifies an attacker, that you act appropriately. Make sure you do have your plans in place to react to an attacker being within your environment. Make sure you have a playbook that's active attacker, and you have identified this within your environment and how it will work. Because these are the things that are going to protect you and save you from a lot more heartache than just reacting to the situation as it unfolds. And you can have a useless show of force afterwards that ends up looking really poor. Anyway, I'll skirt past that whole fucking thing. The whole point of this episode was I'm fascinated by this Spider's Web, Operation Spider's Web. simply from the fact that it is a prime example of how you compromise an organization and get yourself from having nearly no access, being on the defensive foot, being somebody on the outside looking in, getting in and performing a massive amount of damage against a much larger organization. This is how hackers operate. This is how they work. These are the exact tactics and means by which an attacker will get into your environment and cause damage to you and your organization. So defending against it requires knowledge, it requires expertise, but it also requires you to do your fucking job as a security practitioner. You can't rest on your laurels of having monitoring if you're not doing anything about it. You must have monitoring, you must have action, you must have response, whether it's pre-planned, whether it's procedural, whether it's policy, whether it's well-defined, it doesn't matter. You need some sort of response. You need to identify. Obviously, it's better if it's well-defined and mature, but any response is better than no response when it comes to an attacker. And I do have to say that if you have a false positive and you do act on a false positive and it turns out to be a false positive, the one thing that you cannot be ashamed of is doing your job as a security practitioner. So if somebody comes to you and says, "Why the fuck did you lock my account?" You say, "Sorry, bro, trying to keep you secure. Not sorry." And let them deal with the fucking fallout. Because maybe, if they didn't look like an attacker, you wouldn't block them. Anyway, again, make sure that you as a security practitioner are able to identify when an attacker is in your environment and that you're able to act when you detect that. It's not enough to detect. It's not enough to have response policies. We have to be active within our own environments. And that's all I have time for today, guys. I hope you have a great day.